Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first Jewish Council of North Central Florida, that's JCNCF, Book Talk. And before I introduce Rebecca Jefferson, I just wanted to say welcome to those of you that are participating and listening in. It is our hope at the JCNCF that we will bring educational opportunities for you, and this is one of the ways we're going to do it. We have another author talk in January, one in February, and we also will be starting a series on One Nation Under God, Religion in America, which Rebecca is connected to as well. You can tell us about it later, but they're going to be curating at the Price Library a database for people to use as a resource to basically be complementary to the lecture series that we'll be running. And the lectures will be online so that anybody anywhere, and feel free to share this with people whenever you want to share it. So I'm going to introduce Rebecca, and forgive me for reading it, but Rebecca J.W. Jefferson is the curator of the Isser and Ray Price Library of Judaica at the University of Florida and a joint faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies. Prior to moving to Florida, she gained her PhD in medieval Hebrew from the University of Cambridge in 2004 and worked as a research associate in Cambridge University Library. In addition to managing and developing the Price Library, she recently completed a National Endowment for the Humanities Challenge grant, raising a $2 million endowment in support of preserving, collecting, and promoting Jewish heritage materials from Florida, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Her personal research focuses on the history of Judaica libraries and collections, and she has published numerous articles on the discovery of what her book is, the Cairo Genizah. It was just published in February, correct, Rebecca?
It was, yes, that's right.
So it's brand new, hot off the presses. And how we're going to run this show is that I'm going to let Rebecca share and talk about her presentation. If you all will keep yourselves muted, or I will attempt to mute you if I can. I can mute you, I just can't unmute you. And then at the end of her presentation, Rebecca will take questions. So if you have any questions, please hold them for the end. And if you're shy and you don't want to say anything, you can type them into the chat and I will read them, or you can just raise your hand, which is in the box somewhere it's right in the participants. And I figure you all know this from 2.5 years more of being on Zoom. So if you don't know, we'll help you though. So it's a small enough group so we can be friendly. So Rebecca, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Linda, for inviting me to do this, and the JCNCF. I was really excited to be the first in the series. But then when I started to put the talk together, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, how am I going to do this? Because the subject of my book is kind of complicated. First of all, not everybody knows what the Cairo Genizah is. Some people don't even know what a Genizah is. And then the story that's often told about the Cairo Genizah, it's a little bit simplistic, and it's far, far more complicated than has ever been told. And it involves a lot of protagonists, characters, and it's evolved over many decades of the 19th and 20th century. So writing the book was a challenge, and then talking to anybody about it is a challenge because it is a story that you can't really tell in a nutshell. So what I've decided to do was, because I wasn't sure who would attend and who would know anything about the subject, that I would tell the backstory, that I would talk a lot about what a Genizah is, what are Genizot, what is this practice, and who were these early manuscript hunters, and what were their activities that led up to this discovery? What is the significance of this discovery in light of all those activities? And then I hope you'll see where my book comes in. And then I also hope that if it's of interest to you, that maybe then you'll go and read some more of the book. Okay, so first of all, let me see. Now I've got to, there we go. So first of all, we'll start off with a very simple question of what is a Genizah? So the word itself stems from the Hebrew root gimel nun zayin, and it's used as a verb meaning to hide, lignoz, to hide or to store. We first find it in the biblical book of Esther, where it designates a treasury as a noun. Now, our earliest examples of Genizahs may well be the caves at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Certainly, they think there was a Genizah on Masada, underneath the synagogue, where they found very, very early manuscripts. So those are our first known examples of Genizot. It gets discussed, the idea of a Genizah gets discussed a lot in rabbinic literature, and it's really, this is where the practice first arises and stems from. And in rabbinic literature, it's used as a noun. It describes a place where you would store an invalid book or a worn out book. And you find it very often, you find it in the tractate Megillah of the Talmud, where they're discussing what items should be rescued from a fire. Remember that this tractate is being compiled in a period of great uncertainty for the Jewish people. And so part of the thinking is what happens if our synagogue gets raided, our Torah scrolls are looted or destroyed. How do we safeguard our scrolls, our writings? So really what came out of this discussion was the idea that it was the content that was the most important thing and not the container. Nevertheless, the container for the content, since the content was sacred, had to be treated in a respectful manner. One could not allow this container to be destroyed, because it would be as though you were destroying the name of God, a sacred thing. So they sacred objects were treated in the same manner that you would treat the human body, and thus given a proper burial. That's really the classic practice of a Genizah. What happens when the Genizah in Cairo is discovered, the word Genizah then becomes synonymous pretty much with the Cairo Genizah. So whenever anybody talks about a Genizah today, what they have in their minds is what was discovered in Cairo, i.e. many, many manuscripts hidden away in a synagogue attic room, hidden away. And here you can see an image that was created by the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv to show people what a Genizah is through the lens of the Cairo Genizah. So now I'm going to tell you a few elements of the traditional Cairo Genizah story, the way it's often explained to people. And it, as I say, it centers on this building here in Old Cairo, Fustat, Old Cairo, a synagogue that was once known as the Elijah Synagogue, but later in the late 19th and early 20th century becomes known as the Ben Ezra Synagogue, and that's how it's known today. It was one of the few synagogues in the world that had stood the test of time. It stood for 800 years. Essentially, it was the building as it stands now stands on various levels of foundations. As far as archaeologists can tell, there was a building there in the 10th century that was destroyed in 1012. Then another building was built on top of it in 1039. That building lasted through to 1475, when there was a big fire which gutted most of the building, but the foundation stood and the structure stood. And then over time, from 1475 to the 19th century, it underwent various modifications as all of these buildings had to get restored from time to time, because the strong desert winds would often eat away at the walls, and they would need restoring from time to time. But essentially, the structure stood there for 800 years. And now this, what we know today, is the Ben Ezra Synagogue. And as you can see in that picture there, that's actually a restoration from the 1980s. That too is now synonymous with the Cairo Genizah. How did that happen? Well, the way the story is usually told is that it begins with two very adventurous twin sisters, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, who they were both widowed quite early on, and they took trips to Mount Sinai. They were self-taught scholars. They taught themselves Syriac and Arabic and some Hebrew, and they wanted to go and hunt for old versions, ancient versions of the Gospels. They were both Christian women. They were Presbyterian. But in the and here you can see actually a wonderful photograph of them sleeping with one of the parties on their way up to Mount Sinai. And then that other photograph, you can see Agnes Lewis being winched up into a monastery that you could only reach via the windows of the monastery. And so she was quite an adventurous lady. And in fact, she continued to traipse up Mount Sinai well into her 70s. And it was a really arduous journey. So they were amazing women. And they discovered, in fact, one of the earliest copies of the Gospels in Mount Sinai. So that's what made them famous. But in the spring of 1896, they heard that there were some wonderful manuscript finds in the markets of Cairo. And so they changed their plans that spring and went immediately to Cairo to find out what was going on and what they could discover. What they brought home with them were several sacks of Hebrew fragments, and they laid them out on their kitchen table, and they started to decipher them with the Hebrew knowledge that they had. But there were several fragments, many fragments, in fact, in post-biblical Hebrew, which they weren't familiar with. Now, they were both good friends with the teacher of rabbinics at Cambridge University called Solomon Schechter. Now, here in America, we know Solomon Schechter in a different role. We know Solomon Schechter as the founder or the father of the Jewish conservative movement here in America. But prior to that, he was a scholar in Cambridge, among his many friends, he was a very charismatic, brilliant man, and among his many friends were these two sisters. And they asked him to come to their home to decipher one of their fragments, and it was this one that you see before you. And what Solomon Schechter discovered was that this was a medieval copy of the original Ecclesiasticus, that is the book of Ben Sira. And Ben Sira is one of the books that didn't make it into the canon of the Bible. It's a book that's very similar to the book of Proverbs. And it was compiled in the 1st century BCE by Ben Sira, and then his grandson translated it into Greek. Now, the Hebrew version got lost. And so all that was known was the Greek version. The Greek version became part of the church canon. And then for many centuries, particularly in Schechter's time, there was a big debate surrounding the language of this book. And so Schechter was one of the scholars who argued strongly that there was always a Hebrew original. And so here he had in his hand a copy from the Middle Ages of the original Hebrew. And his great knowledge of Talmudic literature enabled him to prove that. And so he was very excited. And so now he realized that coming out of Cairo were some very important pieces, momentous pieces of significance to a big scholarly debate that was happening at the time between the Jewish and Christian scholars of the Bible, particularly in a field known as biblical criticism. The Christian scholars, a group known as the higher critics, were working on trying to date the books of the Bible. But as they did that, they were also rather steeped in their own personal anti-Semitism. For them, all that was genuine about the Bible was the ancient Israelite section of the Bible. Later, post-biblical Judaism they regarded as a later sort of addition that sorry, I've lost my train of thought. It was a sort of a defiled Judaism, if you like. It was not the glorious, pure Judaism represented by the ancient Israelites, of which they regarded themselves as the descendants, the heirs of that ancient Israelite tradition. So there was a rather vigorous debate around all of this, the dating of the Bible books. And so Solomon Schechter being able to show this important piece really fed into that whole debate and helped him enormously. So off he went to Cairo, funded by his good friend Charles Taylor, who was the provost of St. John's College in Cambridge, and he personally funded Schachter to go. Taylor was a mathematician, a Christian, but also a Hebraist. He studied with Schachter, and he supported Schachter's mission very strongly. So here's Schachter. After he returned from Cairo, he was allowed by the chief rabbi of Cairo to go to the Ben Ezra synagogue in Old Cairo. And as the story goes, the chief rabbi kind of gave him the keys to the kingdom and said, you may take as much as you like. And Schachter indeed took everything that he liked and brought back many, many, many sacks of amazing medieval fragments in 1897. And here he was photographed in the old library at Cambridge University, surrounded by these fragments. What was it about this find that was so great? Well, it was truly momentous. It revolutionized the study of medieval Jewish life. Everything written down was stored in this Genizah. Now, normally a Genizah is a place where you would put, as I talked about, sacred writings, Torah scrolls, prayer books, books of the Bible, rabbinics. But what was found here went far beyond that. There are thousands and thousands of documents and letters, personal letters, court records telling us all about Jewish life and community in the Middle Ages, and records and letters, not just from the Jews of Fustat, but from all over the Mediterranean, letters from Sicily, letters pertaining to the Jewish trade that stretched over to India and back. Then we see in the Genizah fragments that shed great light on the development of Jewish liturgy, some of the earliest fragments of music ever written down. The fragment that you see on the right, that's one of the earliest known checks ever written. So the economic system of Jews in the Middle Ages. The fragment that you see on the very far left, that's the handwriting of Maimonides. We have many, many fragments of Maimonides in the Genizah collection. So great Jewish leaders, Jewish community life, personal documents, letters from mothers to sons, dowries showing how women lived in the Middle Ages. Even children's doodles are preserved in the Cairo Genizah. Prescriptions, medicine, everything, every facet of life in that period from all across the Mediterranean is preserved here in these fragments. Now, what was essentially there was mostly from what is now called the classical Genizah period, and that's the 10th through to the 13th centuries. That was the bulk of what was discovered. And that makes sense because that was the period in which Fustat was the center of Jewish life in Egypt. Then you get another set of materials that seem to come from the post-expulsion from Spain period, post-1492. And then there are other sets of materials, smaller amounts, that come from a much later period. So essentially, you've got pieces that date from, well, you've got palimpsests, and those are writings that are written over more ancient writing. So those date from the 8th century right through to the 19th century. So it's across time, across space, and incredibly significant. So I worked with all of this material. I had the great privilege of working with it in Cambridge, and my job was as the bibliographer, and I had to research all the publications that were made with this material and were being made with this material. And at some point, and this ties into your question about the AI and the digitization of fragments. It was in when was it? It was in 1990, I hope I'm getting this correct, 1997, I think, that they first started to talk about digitizing the fragments. Now, there were fragments spread all around the world, not just at Cambridge. Cambridge had the largest portion, but these circles that you can see here, these are all the collections of Genizah fragments around the world in institutions around the world, in Bodleian, Oxford, in Manchester, in New York, in France, in Switzerland and Hungary. They're everywhere. And so when discussions about digitizing them occurred, for the first time, I started to think about these other collections, because the story I just told you is essentially about the Cambridge collection. But how did these other collections come to be? Where did they come from? Who gathered them? How come if Schechter went and took everything, how can these other pieces occurred? And slowly, as I started to research this, the story started to, one, unravel, and two, become very expansive indeed. So as I said, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the before Schechter discoveries, the manuscript hunters and the Genizot that were available, so that you can see how it led to this massive discovery. I hope this is making sense. Anyway, so what were people, how did this all occur? What were people looking for? So I mentioned that that Solomon Schechter was so excited to find Ben Sira because of these debates with the biblical critics of the day. Well, that's essentially what manuscript hunters were really keen to find. It was a period of intense scholarship on the Bible with the new tools of language, growing knowledge of ancient languages, and old manuscripts actually coming to light. But with regard to the Hebrew Bible, there weren't many old witnesses to the Hebrew Bible. So the oldest witness was the Aleppo Codex. In Schechter's day and beforehand, there was the Aleppo Codex. Now, this was from 920 CE. And it was the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. And now the oldest scroll available, this was prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The oldest scroll available was in Bologna, and it was 12th to 13th century. So as you can see that when they're trying to read the Bible, understand the Bible, date the Bible, it's very difficult because there are only medieval copies available. What happened to all those ancient copies? Well, there were manuscript hunters determined to find them. One of them, he's going to be our first manuscript hunter, although he doesn't really come into the Genizah story so much. He's certainly not in my book. He was on the cutting room floor, I'm afraid. But I find him fascinating because he represents perhaps one of the Christian manuscript hunters who were involved in this race. He's a very interesting character because he decided to visit Siberia and Bukhara. And he actually got a letter from the chief rabbi of England, Herman Adler, to introduce him to the Jews of Bukhara so that he could inquire about their condition. Well, this was a little bit of an exaggeration on his part. Really, he wanted to go and see what manuscripts they had. And so he visited them and gave them his letter of introduction, and they took him to their Genizah, which was a shelf in the old synagogue in Bukhara, which he reported had 20 or 30 Torah scrolls piled high, but he didn't go exploring any further than that, and he came away empty-handed. But before he went, he asked some of the leading scholars, Hebraists, what he should look for when he's manuscript hunting, and I'll read you what they said. Buy no Korans or Persian manuscripts, nothing in fact but Hebrew and Syriac. Rolls of the Pentateuch and Esther, do not touch. Rolls of other books, yes. Manuscripts in book form generally may be examined, even of the Pentateuch. And the larger the characters and the fewer divisions between the words, the better. Also, 2 columns on a page are better than 3, and illuminations are better still. So they kind of given him a sense of what to look for, but he came away empty-handed. And then afterwards, some very interesting material started to come out of Bukhara, and he was kind of kicking himself for not having taken anything. So he went back and eventually came back with a scroll of Esther, even though he was told not to. Among the Jewish manuscript hunters, we first have people who were actually searching for the lost tribes of Israel. This was quite a phenomenon in the 19th century. And it was Jews and Christians were very interested in the so-called lost tribes. This was Israel Joseph Benjamin. He called himself Benjamin II after a famous medieval Jewish traveler called Benjamin of Tudela. Benjamin of Tudela toured around the world and wrote an amazing travelogue and recorded all of everything he saw. And it's one of our sources for medieval Jewish life. And Benjamin II tried to do the same thing. And here you can see he went to visit the Jews of Kifil near the Euphrates and saw their medieval synagogue. Today, sadly, it's being turned into a mosque, but you can still go and still see these inscriptions on the synagogue walls. And he described the Genizah that he saw there. He said, in the interior of the synagogue is a certain room which is always kept shut. It is never even entered by the Jews, and it's certainly therefore not accessible to anyone else. It's so-called Genizah, in which old manuscripts are kept, are said to date from ancient times and to have come from different places. This place for the preservation of old relics is held in great veneration by the followers of every creed. So he's one of the earliest eyewitnesses to see a Genizah in the Middle East. Another traveler, manuscript hunter was Jacob Sophia. He'd moved with his family from Lithuania, and when he was a child, his parents sadly died. He was an orphan, so he was raised by a group of people called the Perushim in Jerusalem. And when he was he's not pictured here, he's not a young man, but when he was a young man, he was sent out to raise funds among the Jewish communities of Asia and Australia for building the Herva synagogue in Jerusalem. And he had an amazing adventure, and he visited here. You can see the synagogue of the Jews of Kerala in Cochin, and that's the one of the Jewish Indian Torah scrolls. And he purchased many manuscripts on the way. Now, he had a personal interest in what a movement at the time known as the Haskalah movement, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, and that really was a sort of republic of letters. In which the scholars of this movement were very interested in reviving the Hebrew language. And he was interested in that. And so he went to every synagogue he could find, looked at all of their Torah scrolls, reported on them. And when he returned, he wrote a book, his travelogue, in which he described all of these synagogues that he saw and the Torah scrolls in them. He also accidentally went through Yemen. He had his funds stolen from him en route, and so he ended up in the Yemen. And he was one of the first people to visit the very remote Jewish communities in the Yemen. And he was the first to convey Yemenite history and culture. And he also brought back manuscripts, very, very significant manuscripts, such as this you can see here, Midrash HaGadol. And the Midrash HaGadol was a 13th century commentary on the Pentateuch. And very, very important because it retained sections of ancient rabbinic writings that had been lost elsewhere. So the Yemenites had retained that in their tradition, and Yaakov Sophia brought it back with him to Jerusalem and told the world about it. And so now people were starting to get a sense that some very important, significant manuscripts could indeed still be found among all these ancient communities in the Middle East. But the man who really brought Genizahs to the forefront was this gentleman here called Abraham Firkovich. Now, Abraham Firkovich was a Karaite. He was born to a Karaite family in Russia. And he grew up very aware of the fact that there was a paucity of material pertaining to the history of the Karaites. And he very much wanted to change that. And by 1834, he was already working for a Karaite publishing house. And then in that same decade, he was appointed by the local governor on a government-sponsored mission to discover the history of the Karaites. So Firkovich, with great zeal, visited around places where there were older Jewish communities, such as the Crimea, and went looking for as many ancient manuscripts as he could find that might give insights into Karaite history, and not just Karaite manuscripts, but also Rabbinite manuscripts that might have insights into Karaite history. And I just realized I need to backtrack a minute because I didn't explain what Karaites are to anybody that doesn't know. So the Karaites were a sort of Jewish dissidents. It was a movement founded in the 8th century in Baghdad. And the Karaites rejected rabbinic law, rejected oral law, and only adhered to biblical law. They were strong adherents and strongly connected only to the Bible. And so that was a movement that began in the 8th century and lasted through, well, today, there are Karaites today. And there you can see in the middle is a photograph of some of the Karaite graves in the Crimea. Now, Firkovich was so zealous to tell this history that I'm afraid he became a rather infamous forger. And so he often rubbed out some of the Hebrew letters on the tombstones and altered them to make them look older than they were. And this fragment that you can see on the right, that was his attempt at rubbing out where the manuscript contains the date and information in order to make it fit Karaite history and make Karaite history seem more ancient than it was. But among the many great things that he found, many genuine, non-forged great things that he found, was this wonderful Leningrad Codex, which was the oldest complete dating manuscript of the Hebrew Bible from the 11th century. I had a note that I wanted to tell you about the Leningrad Codex. Yes, we don't know how he got it. We know that it was first written actually in Fustat, and it was commissioned by a Persian Karaite, eventually sold to a Jerusalem yeshiva, and then eventually made its way to Damascus, and then finally somehow to Odessa, where it got into Firkovich's hands. But we don't know the path of how it got there. At any rate, he'd now discovered that through all of his searches in Karaite synagogues and Rabbinite synagogues, that there were manuscripts of great note to be found. In fact, the Athenaeum magazine reported how he'd sacrificed fortune for rare and old manuscripts, bore long separations from his family, endangered his own life, lived for months in churchyards and burial places, penetrated synagogues and other places where the Jews used to hide books. And thus he has succeeded in finding 124 Hebrew original copies of the Old Testament, older than all the other Hebrew codices in any of the libraries of Europe. So his first collection was very well received and eventually donated to the Imperial Library in St. Petersburg, which is today's Russian National Library. But how did he come across Genizahs? Well, he discovered them sort of by accident. The first one is not pictured here. It was a synagogue in a place called Cairo Bazaar. And that synagogue had a Bet Midrash within it. And he noticed that all the students were rather cramped into the Bet Midrash and that there was this kind of almost false looking wall. And he asked about it. And they said to him, oh, within that wall is our Genizah. And that's why the students have this cramped environment. So Firkovich used all of his powers of authority given to him by the governor, brought in the local authorities who helped him break down this wall. And it was a terrible thing because it was the Rabbinite community felt certain that there would be some terrible curse would happen to them by the breaking down of this wall. And when the wall was broken down, Firkovich reported seeing thousands of manuscripts, ancient manuscripts. Then he went and did the same thing to this synagogue in the Crimea. This dates from the 14th century, 1309. The Jewish community of Crimea originally came from Genoa in Italy, and they came as part of the trading routes. They came there in the 12th century and set up a community here. And so it was on the port. And this was a rabbinite synagogue. And again, having now found that a Genizah could contain many very interesting things, Firkovich again brought the authorities in and forced them to let him see their Genizah. This one was hidden in, they had two. One was hidden in a vault underneath the bima, and the other was hidden in the synagogue attic, but was totally impenetrable. Firkovich got several students to build a rickety ladder out of old boards, and they put this ladder up to the attic and climbed very slowly onto it. And because they couldn't sort of pick and choose, they threw all of the manuscripts out into the yard. And he reported that there were cartloads of manuscripts in the courtyard. And then he chose what he wanted, and the rest got placed into the vault behind the bima. And there was a visitor there some decades later who recalled seeing it and recalled seeing a pile 10 feet high of ancient manuscripts. Sadly, this synagogue got destroyed during the Second World War, and the manuscripts just disappeared, probably destroyed as well. So prior to Firkovich discovering that there was such a thing as a Genizah and it could hold amazing things, most scholars and collectors believed that ancient materials, once they were placed in a Genizah, that they were forever damaged and lost. And in fact, there were Christian scholars from this biblical criticism scholars who even suggested that that the ancient books of the Bible had purposely been placed in a Genizah in order to so that people couldn't know what the ancient form of the Bible looked like once the Masoretic text had been established. So here you can see some examples of Genizahs around the world, and even into today's day, we still bury books when possible. But there was an ethnographic survey done of Jewish immigrants to Israel coming from Middle Eastern communities, and they were asked what their practices were and where they buried materials, where they hid them, and what they placed there. And so you can see here some of the images of some of these synagogues in these from these ancient communities. And really their practice of Genizah was very varied indeed. They place them in cemeteries as you would expect, but they also place them behind the bima, under between walls, as Firkovich found, under foundations, in cupboards, in niches, in arks. What happened was sometimes they would accumulate over time and then they would be taken out and buried. Other times they would just be buried in situ. But 14 of the groups said that they buried them in cemeteries. One person said that they placed their Genizah, their materials in the river. So of course those would not survive. But as long as what came to be discovered was, as long as materials were stored in dry places with very little light and no fluctuation in temperature, they were in fact likely to survive. And so here you can see some images of some places in Cairo where such material could survive, underground, in tombs, in underground chambers, and in disused cisterns, water cisterns. And then just recently in 2012, a Genizah was discovered in Afghanistan, in the Bamyan region, in the complex of caves. So very much tying into the idea that Qumran was also possibly a Genizah an ancient Genizah. And here we see that the medieval Jews of Afghanistan also stored their materials in caves. And caves are cool, dark environments where materials can survive. And many of these fragments pertain to Jewish life in various regions of Afghanistan. So that was an amazing find too. Now, the Yemenite Jews, you may have noticed the cover of my book, is a photograph of a manuscript that we actually have in the Price Library of Judaica. It's a Yemenite manuscript. The Yemenites actually stored their ancient manuscripts within the bindings of their books. And so that's, you can see in the binding of our book. And also on the left, these came up for auction just recently, fragments that were found in another manuscript binding. So I hope you're seeing that Genizot are very varied over time, over place, and not just one thing, not just a room in a synagogue in Cairo, but many Genizot around the world. And in fact, also in Jerusalem, explorers went looking for Genizot. This one, these are the tombs of Jehoshaphat and Absalom in the Kidron Valley. And there are many, if you look at many of the travelogues of the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, you can see many explorers tried to penetrate them to see what they could find in them. They didn't have a lot of success, but we do have an eyewitness account from a Jewish visitor called Philip Abraham in 1879. And he actually talked about the process of taking the materials to the Genizah in Jerusalem. And he said, "A great ceremony called the burying of the law lately took place in the Spanish synagogue of Jerusalem. It happens once in every 8 or 10 years and is accompanied with the following ceremonies." Oh, that's my timer to tell me. Okay, I'll go a bit faster. It happens once every 8 or 10 years. There's a Talmud Torah synagogue, a subterranean cave wherein any old leaf torn out of any holy book is deposited by all the Jewish inhabitants in Jerusalem of every minhag. After 8 or 10 years, when the cave is full, these old papers and books are brought out and made into bales. This done, the Jews assemble at a given time in the afternoon. A kosher or faultless Sefer Torah is brought out by the Chacham Bashi and carried by him and the other rabbis at the head of the procession. He is followed by the other rabbis. Next come the bales, about 70 or 80 in number, each carried by a Jew, and then the rest of the people. The procession winds its way slowly out of the Zion gate for some distance along the city wall, and then descends into the valley of Jehoshaphat, where the burial ground is situated. Here is a very deep well where the bales are finally thrown amidst the singing of the joyous crowd. So Firkovich, now aware that about Genizot, is very anxious to go and explore the medieval synagogues in the Middle East. And so he goes on a second trip. His first collection is known as the first Firkovich collection, the second collection as the second Firkovich collection. And this was very much a Genizah fragment collection. He collected from everywhere. He collected from Syria. He managed to get to see the Aleppo Codex, but they banned him from seeing it a second time because they suspected that he was trying to alter it. He found a way to get to the Samaritan synagogue in Nablus, and he acquired a new method of getting their material. This time he said he would give them funds to renovate their synagogue if in turn they would give him their Genizah, which they did. He also, while he was based in Jerusalem, wrote off lots of letters to Jewish communities around the world, particularly to the Jews in Iraq. And he told them, send me your manuscript, anything, even if it looks bad to you, even if it's just a fragment, something you wouldn't keep, send it to me. So he did that. And then he went to Egypt and started to penetrate the Great Genizah in the Karaite synagogue. The Karaite synagogue was also a medieval synagogue. It'd first been located in Old Cairo next to the Ben Ezra synagogue, but then later moved to Cairo proper, where it became known as the Dar Simcha synagogue. Today it's the Musa Deri synagogue. And they retained not just an amazing Genizah, but also many incredible codices that they still have in their library today. And at the same time, in that summer of 1864, Jacob Sophia is back from the Yemen, and he wants to try and get into the Ben Ezra synagogue, and he convinces the custodians to let him climb up to the rooftop, where he sees and reports on a Genizah that's filled up high, that he can only pull a few fragments out of, and he wonders what lies beneath. His statement about what lay beneath was very tantalizing to many scholars. And I hope, as my book shows, actually it was a little bit misleading, because later scholars said that what Schechter found was what Jacob Sophia hinted at. But I don't think actually that may have been the case. Anyway, we have to skip forward very fast to the 1860s and 1880s, when many restorations took place on medieval synagogues around Egypt. The Maimonides synagogue in the Jewish quarter, the Elim Shati synagogue in Machala al-Kubra, they all were renovated. They were all brought down to their foundations and rebuilt new. So the Genizot within them, we don't know what happened to them. They may have been dispersed to other places. They may have been buried. The same thing happened to the Ben Ezra synagogue. And this is the important thing that nobody ever talks about in the traditional telling of the Cairo Genizah story, where Solomon Schechter goes in and whips out the ancient Genizah that's been there for 800 years. In fact, the synagogue was demolished in 1889. Two people appear on the scene in 1889, a Reverend Greville John Chester, a Sheffield minister, and he's one of the first to see the synagogue demolished. And he encounters a room full of manuscripts. And he writes very quickly and hurriedly to the Bodleian Library and asks them, do you want these Hebrew manuscripts? I've just uncovered a room full of them. Please tell me if you want them. And over the next 2 years, he secretly starts sending them packages of these manuscripts. And they're very significant. A Babylonian Talmud from 1123, a polemic against the Karaites from 1112, very, very significant fragments. At the same time, on the ground, conducting excavations for the Egypt Exploration Fund is this shadowy figure known as the Count Dulst. He's a whole story in himself, and he finds manuscripts buried underground near the synagogue, and he sends them on to the Egypt Exploration Fund that sends them on to the Bodleian. This is a postcard from much later when he describes how he them. And some of his early fragments concern property rights in Fustat from 1052, sermons for Purim from 1170. So you can see this really early material that the two of them discovered when the synagogue was demolished in 1889. Chester returns to the scene in March 1892, and he finds the old synagogue completely rebuilt. And he's very rude about it. In fact, he's not terribly friendly towards the Jewish people. And he's quite rude about it. And he says he calls it an abomination, a hideous square abomination, this new building. The most important thing about this is that nobody has ever spoken about what happened to the fragments between 1889 and 1892. They just disappeared. All we know is that they started to come out through the markets, through the antiquities trade. But at this point, we no longer know what was originally there. We only know what Schechter found when he went in 1896, 1897. But what he discovered was a collection that had been placed into a new building and possibly placed there as late as 1895 or 1896. So what my book tries to do is to uncover the stories of all these people collecting Genizah fragments from around the Middle East, all of the people connected to the trade in fragments from the early period right through to the 20th century, to really get at the heart and nature of what this Cairo Genizah is. And here is a picture of just some of the individuals involved in this story, collectors and dealers, and I can only fit a certain amount of them on this slide, so it's not all of them. And so that's what my book goes into. And as I said, it's a complicated and convoluted story. And so I hope I've just given you a taste of some of it. So thank you for listening.
Wow. Thank you, Rebecca. It sounds It almost sounds like it could be a like Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of thing.
But many people, many raiders.
Yes, and my husband
Yes.
put it into the
Oh,
comments
yes.
that the fellow in the chain now looked like he was John Cleese.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. You're right.
does anybody have any questions? I mean, we're small groups. If you just want to unmute yourself and say something, then does anybody have any questions? I mean, I'm curious. Are there still, I presume since you did this research, there are still people like the folks that you mentioned over all the years that are still going out and searching and trading in fragments, and it's an ongoing thing.
Indeed they are. It is an ongoing thing, and it gets more complicated and to research the provenance of them as time goes on and the more hands that are involved. And so, yes, you'll often see some of the images I showed you are from auction houses, and you'll often see these fragments come up for sale. And some of them will just say, like 20 fragments for sale from the Cairo Genizah. They won't say how they know they're from the Cairo Genizah. That's the only provenance you're given. And they'll sell for tens of thousands of dollars. In fact, some of the people dealing. Yeah, go on. Yes.
How much are people paying for these things?
Yeah, right now it could be tens of thousands of dollars for a fragment. Back in the day, one of the characters that I look at, a rabbi from Jerusalem who was selling material to Cambridge and Oxford, his name was Solomon Aaron Wertheimer. He was selling them for shillings. And then he was being told by them, the institutions, no, that's too expensive, I'll give you half. So yeah, it's incredible to see how now that they're associated with the Cairo Genizah, how their worth has shot up. Yeah.
Hi, Rebecca. Lovely to
Hi.
see you again.
You too, Heath.
Yeah, I always enjoy your presentations.
Thank you.
You know, I'm wondering, you know, you just showed us many Genizahs, and yet the Cairo Genizah seems to be what everybody refers to, or, you know,
Yes.
it's in the title of the books, and I'm
Yes.
wondering why. And I also am very curious about how they know that it was Maimonides' handwriting.
Right. So the first question, it's the Cairo Genizah it became the Genizah that everybody spoke about and speaks about because of the story that was told after Schechter brought back the material. And he started the legend himself pretty much. And he's the one who started referring to it as the Genizah. And so thereafter that, every time as scholars started to work on this material, they started to use, and they wanted to be able to give it some history, they would use the histories that were written about it at the time. And those histories colored it as the Genizah. All other Genizot sort of were forgotten about. And the idea that, and even Schechter didn't reveal fully the fact that he acquired materials from the Karaite synagogue, from the Basatine cemetery, an ancient cemetery in Cairo that had been the site of where fragments had been buried for centuries, that he'd also acquired fragments from dealers in Cairo, that he'd also acquired fragments from Hebron when he visited Palestine. So his collection didn't all come from the Ben Ezra synagogue, but he didn't talk about that. For him, the story that he told was the story of the Ben Ezra synagogue, the Genizah, and then that's the story that got told ever after that. And as for Maimonides, some of the fragments are signed Moshe Bar Maimon. And they're responsa fragments where he's answering somebody who sent him a question on a matter of law, and he signs his name. And so now we can see whenever his handwriting has been used. It's always
Did he live in Egypt? I've forgotten.
He did. He started in Spain and then he moved to Egypt. He became the physician for the caliph. And so that the Ben Ezra synagogue was his synagogue. And so that would explain why his fragments are there. That makes perfect sense. And so the sort of things that we can date to Fustat that make sense to have been in Fustat. There are many. I mean, I would say the majority of the material, it would make sense that they were once buried in or around Old Cairo. But there are many fragments there that just they don't fit that story.
But did I hear that the Cairo Genizah, the real Cairo Genizah, has contributions, has script from multiple places?
Right. So this
Or
is
would bring things from afar to be disposed of there?
right. So what happened was after over time, as scholars worked on it and told this story, scholars coming to things that didn't fit the story would have to try and make them fit. So if they've got a letter that's been sent from Sicily to Jerusalem, the sender is in Sicily, the recipient is in Jerusalem. How did his letter end up in Cairo? So they would have to kind of fit it and say, well, it probably then belonged to a relative who took it to Cairo. And then when they'd finished with it, they put it in the Genizah. So that might be true. That might be true. But there might be another explanation. Maybe this fragment was in a different Genizah, and maybe it entered the antiquities trade and came via a different route to the story that's been told.
Fascinating.
It is, I was gonna say, fascinating. Does anybody have any other questions or comments?
Allie has her hand up.
Who has their hand up?
Allie.
Oh, Allie, are you actually raising your hand physically?
Yes, I am.
Go
So,
ahead, Allie. I
Robert,
didn't see it on
you mentioned the Bukharan Jews and
Yes.
the guy who went to Uzbekistan, Bukhara. And last year I learned about the Bukharan Jews for the first time when I was reading applications for an Ivy League university. And there was somebody 17 years old who had talked about his Bukharan background, and that there was even a language that's sort of like a Yiddish spoken by Bukharan Jews. So, because he said he spoke Bukhari, and I'm like, what is Bukhari?
Yes.
And so I read about it online and realized in reading about it, because I was curious, that all of the Bukharan Jews, there's only like 10 to 50 Jews left in Bukhara.
Yes,
They're all old, and they only stay there to take care of the cemeteries. That's and so that means that everything else from Bukhara has been taken to New York City and its environs, basically Queens. I'm wondering, what's in Queens that's been taken back from the Bukharan Jews. So that's one question. And anyway, that was my question, I guess.
I'm not sure. I've not looked into what's in New York, although some of the New York collections came through a Genizah collector known as Elkan Nathan Adler. He was the son and brother of the chief rabbis of England. And he was a bibliophile, crazy about collecting, and he collected from Jewish communities around the Middle East. And that picture I showed you of the Bukharan Jews in their synagogue, that was taken by him. He visited them in 1905, and he acquired materials from the Genizah, and that went into his Genizah collection, which is about 25,000 fragments that eventually ended up in the Jewish Theological Seminary of New York. So it's one of the major Genizah collections. And in his case, sorry, this is just an aside, in his case, again, his collection doesn't all come from the Ben Ezra synagogue. He visited Genizot in Alexandria, in Jerusalem, in Bukhara, all over the place. And he just threw all of his fragments in together. So it's really a mishmash and difficult to know what came from where. So some of the collections in New York might be related to him, and I'm not sure about the others. There were collectors who acquired materials and took them back to England. As for the other materials, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happened to their Torah scrolls, for example.
In this scholarship, are people kind of angry that these people took all of these materials, because it's like archaeology. If you don't find them where they're supposed to be lying,
Right.
it's like finding the 10,000-year-old hunter next to his dog that's been buried with, a spear in his mouth.
Yes.
If it got moved out of place, you don't have the background of when it happened, how it happened, that kind of thing.
That's the argument I've been trying to make with my book, that you have to have, archaeologists call it provenience. That's the find spot. You have to record the find spot. And you have to record. I mean, that's how archaeology developed into the great science it is, by archaeologists realizing that you have to document everything that's found around the object to know more about the object. And so it was a great shame the way this came out. I mean, on the one hand, when I speak about it, I don't want to take away from the massive treasure that this is, and how I said on that one of those first slides, it revolutionized our knowledge of medieval jewelry. We didn't know so much of what we know today. We just didn't know before these fragments came to light. On the other hand, it's a real shame the way they did get spread around the world, and their provenance and provenience is lost because we could know even more than we know. And then there's the question of whether it's maybe possibly a difficult ethical question of whether they should have even been unearthed, because the Jewish communities that buried them meant for them to be buried and forever hidden. And some of these communities, like the ones that Furkovich visited, even felt that some terrible calamities would come upon them by the unearthing of these Genizot. And we might today regard that as superstitious, but that was their practice, that was their feeling. And so ethically, there are questions there about how this material was acquired.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Thank you. This has been fascinating, and we thank everybody for joining in. And the recording will be made available, and we'll send it out with our Shabbat Shalom that will go out on Friday. If there's anyone here that doesn't get my messages and wants to, some of you know me outside of Gainesville, so just shoot me a message and I'd be happy to put you on the list. But Rebecca, thank you so much for being our inaugural speaker.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
Fascinating. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your evening, great weekend, and happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you.